Everyone, this week we're going to be talking about social class, the effects that social class has on us, and how we perceive class and inequality in our everyday lives. So to get started, let's take a look at this oft-quoted passage from F. Scott Fitzgerald. And you've probably seen a version of this quote, but maybe not sort of the full description or thought that Fitzgerald has to offer. So in the original work, Fitzgerald says, "Let me tell you about the very rich. They are different from you and me. They possess and enjoy early, and it does something to them. It makes them soft where we are hard and cynical where we are trustful, in a way that, unless you were born rich, it is very difficult to understand." So regardless of whether or not you agree with this quote, kind of nestled within it is this idea that our class status, our access to resources, can really profoundly change different aspects of our psychology. So let's see whether or not this is true. First, let's talk about whether or not your stereotypes of social class kind of agree with this quote. Do you actually think that the rich differ from, quote unquote, you and me? So to start off, I'd like you to quickly pause this video and just mentally or on paper brainstorm 5 psychological traits that you associate with wealth or class. And once you have those down, let's take a look at some of the responses that I've gotten from previous in-person classes. So this is just a snapshot from one of my classes last year, and students in this class said things like, the rich might be more snobby, more arrogant, more self-centered. They're ascribing ignorance. Someone said indolence, which means, laziness. That people might be privileged, insensitive. So there's these kind of ideas floating around that might have to do with things like being more dominant, right? Arrogance, or snobbishness, or entitlement, right? How much somebody might be aggressive or assertive relative to people who are lower in social class. There's also this idea that the rich might be especially cold rather than warm. So maybe they're less empathetic, more egotistical and self-centered, less trusting. And finally, some traits that come up that include things like ignorant or indolent or lazy. This idea that being rich kind of makes you soft and maybe takes away your work ethic. So some of these things actually kind of line up with the empirical psychological research. And I want you to take a quick moment to try to predict which of these categories of traits you think are actually accurate in terms of describing how the wealthy differ from the less wealthy. Okay, so here's the answer. It turns out that indeed, people who come from higher socioeconomic status backgrounds do tend to be more dominant and do tend to be in some ways more cold, although there's not necessarily any evidence that very rich people act in ways that are less competent. So if you guessed dominant or cold, you would actually be right on the money. No pun intended. So before we get deeper into this, I want to take a moment to actually define what I mean by class. And it turns out that class or socioeconomic status is kind of complicated. So there's one set of techniques or sort of benchmarks you could use to measure SES, and that includes asking people about very objective things, objective markers of the status or power that they might possess. So, for instance, what kind of job do you have? What's your income annually? How much money do you make? What's the highest degree that you've obtained, right? But even if you're looking at specifically just objective markers of socioeconomic status, you can have some conflict, right? Some disagreement. You might have, for instance, doctors who have very high levels of education and extremely high occupational prestige, but because they're in the early stages of residency, let's say they make only, I'm putting only in quotes here, $50,000 a year, and they actually have a lot of debt. Whereas you might have an electrician, right? So fewer years of education, maybe an associate's degree, lower societal prestige. But because electricians are in really high demand, they might actually make $70,000 a year and be debt-free, so have more wealth. So who in this situation has higher socioeconomic status? It's a difficult question. So then, in addition to objective socioeconomic status, there is a whole other category of measures that is called subjective socioeconomic status. And with this, it's really about how people feel like they fall within their community, right? Where do they fit in? Are they at the top of the pile or the bottom of the pile? And to measure this, you might do something like literally show a person a picture of a ladder with the rungs marked off from 1 to 10 and asking them, please mark kind of the rung on the ladder that represents where you fall in the power structure of your community or your society. Now, you might think, okay, these are two different ways of getting at the same question, but surely they show similar results. Well, subjective and objective SES tend to be moderately, but not perfectly correlated. In fact, this is also moderated by race. So for white Americans, subjective SES predicts things like job or income at a moderate correlation of like 0.3, 0.4. Interestingly, for Black Americans, that correlation is somewhere around 1.15, so much lower. In other words, for Black Americans, having more income or highest status job doesn't translate as neatly into feeling like you have power and status in your community. So again, the relationship between objective and subjective socioeconomic status is complicated. So it turns out that social class also affects things like how we act towards others in social interactions, how we perceive our environments, and even things like whether or not we act in a moral, ethical, or decent manner. And you might be able to predict the sort of directions that we're going to see here. So the first thing that we're going to be focusing on is whether or not socioeconomic status tends to affect interpersonal behavior. And I'm going to be telling you about a study that was conducted at UC Berkeley by Michael Kraus and Dr. Keltner. And this was looking at two basic questions. One, do students who come from higher socioeconomic status backgrounds, so this is measured using their parents' income and their parents' education, do they treat other people differently in everyday getting to know you conversations? And if they do treat people differently, is this something where someone, just an impartial third-party observer, looking at a small slice of these interactions, would they be able to tell which students come from rich families based off of this behavior? And really what they were looking at is the level of kind of interpersonal interest and engagement that each student indicated in each other. So you might have pairs of students where they're both coming from relatively low SES backgrounds, maybe both coming from high SES, mixed SES pairs as well. And do these pairs of students show different levels of kind of interest and enthusiasm in the conversation? They're looking at behaviors like whether or not students would do these sort of distracted things like playing with their hair. They had some objects in the room that they could have used to do things like doodle with a pen and paper. Maybe they take that pen and they're kind of playing with it, or they're taking off their sunglasses and they're kind of playing with the sunglasses. These things that wouldn't really signal interest in the conversation. Those are called disengagement cues. And those are being contrasted with engagement cues. So the students nodding their heads, raising their eyebrows to indicate recognition or interest, and laughing at what the other person has had to say. So here are the results. For grooming and doodling and playing with things like pens and sunglasses and smartphones, you see the upper higher class students are doing more of that, and they're doing it for longer. The students who come from lower class backgrounds are doing less of it. They're doing it for less time. Whereas the students who come from poorer families or whose parents have achieved less education are nodding more, raising their eyebrows more dramatically, and spending a lot more time laughing at what the other person has to say. So pretty interesting. Now, I just want to give you a little bit more of a vivid picture of what it might look like for someone to engage in really disengaged interpersonal behavior versus really engaged personal behavior. And first off, we're going to watch a little video by Blake Lively on a late night TV show. Now, note that actually Blake Lively comes from a pretty rich family, but she's engaging in behaviors that indicate a lot of engagement.
Did you took etiquette classes? Is this?
Yeah, I thought it was time. I mean, I just like laid upon your desk when I arrived, so you can tell that like, I don't really have my act together, but I'm working on it. I went to dinner once with Anna Wintour and Karl Lagerfeld, which is just like, I'm sitting there thinking like, who invited me here? And you know, I'm ordering like the scones with the bacon and the cheese and the butter and like getting it on my elbows and my toes and like
were you at?
the Ritz in Paris.
Oh,
like,
wow,
where,
gotcha.
that was loud.
Yeah.
But like where Coco Chanel lived.
Yeah.
And ate.
Right, so we're noticing that Blake Lively is smiling and making strong eye contact and gesturing and leaning forward, right? Engaged, highly engaged. And this is what we might see in that UC Berkeley study from students who come from lower SES backgrounds. Now let's look at the flip of this.
I saw this movie the other night. Tremendous. What a tremendous film. You and who else is in it? What's her name? Beautiful, lovely... Gwyneth Paltrow.
Oh, yeah, Gwyneth Paltrow, Vanessa Shaw.
Very nice movie.
All right, so disinterested, right? Not a lot of eye contact. You can imagine, although we don't see it specifically, you can imagine Joaquin Phoenix doing something like playing with his beard, playing with his hair, playing with objects, right? Not nodding, not laughing. So what's interesting, right, is we're not just interested in these UC Berkeley studies in whether students from low SES backgrounds acted differently than rich students, but also whether other people could watch these videos and pick up on social class due to these different behaviors. And this is exactly what we see. So other students who watched 60-second snippets of these videos actually were able to estimate each participant's socioeconomic status with much better than chance accuracy. So SES does appear to be associated with distinct patterns of nonverbal behavior, and these are things that outside observers pick up on. So then, the same researchers, Michael Krauss and Dr. Keltner, did an experiment to actually measure the effects of social status on empathy. They manipulated students' perceptions of their socioeconomic status by asking them to compare themselves to different slices of society. So you've got a student, you know, they've just started at Berkeley, so pretty high prestige school, and then you think about how much worse off you could be. All the people who don't have access to those resources or that education. Or you ask people to compare themselves to the most powerful members of society, which presumably should make you feel smaller and less important in contrast, in comparison, right? So you've got some students who are comparing them using downward comparisons, so they should feel more powerful. Some students who are using upward comparisons, so they should feel less powerful. And then they finally assess their sort of social acuity and accuracy using this task called reading the mind in the eyes. It's a really simple measure. It was actually originally developed as an indicator of autism or Asperger's, kind of autism spectrum disorder. And it goes something like this. You see these little slices that are taken from advertisements. And in these advertisements, in the full things, it's usually pretty clear what kind of mental state the person is in. But you take a snippet that only includes the eyes. You're given 4 plausible words that could describe this person's mental state. So for this person, it would be irritated, thoughtful, encouraging, or sympathetic. And then you have to guess, what emotion is this person actually feeling? Okay, so make your guess. And in this case, the correct answer is thoughtful, or at least that's what the researchers would say. All right, let's do this one more time. You see this slice of the face. This guy could be indifferent or embarrassed or skeptical or dispirited. And in this case, the correct answer is skeptical. So they go through a bunch of different trials like this, and what you find is that the students who made upward comparisons, they're comparing themselves to Jeff Bezos, right? They're comparing themselves to, you know, the rich and the famous, so they feel less powerful in comparison. They actually get a slightly higher number of these answers correct. So even feeling momentarily less privileged might make you a little bit more savvy and sensitive to the emotions of other people, which is really interesting. Okay, So how can we explain these different patterns of results? We have results on one hand indicating that people from lower SES backgrounds tend to be warmer and more enthusiastic and engaged in conversations. They nod, they laugh, they don't do things where you're showing disengagement. And also, they might be a little bit more attuned and empathetic to the emotions that someone else is feeling. Pretty cool, right? But why the hell would this be? Well, psychologists have come up with something called contextualism theory. And this is the idea that if you don't have a lot of money and resources or prestige, the everyday ups and downs of life can have a much bigger impact on you. If you get sick, you might not have high-quality health insurance to protect you. You might not have an extra $10,000 in your bank account to pay medical bills. Losing your job might be much more disastrous. Getting in a car accident might be much more disastrous. You're a lot more affected by external forces, right? And what that might mean is since you don't have a bank account to rely on, other people in your community might become a much more important resource. Your extended family, right? Your neighbors, members of your church, members of other social groups. And this makes you feel less independent from other people. Whereas people with abundant resources and very high rank or status might be able to feel like they can be very agentic, independent, a lot of freedom in their lives, and this might lead to more self-focused, selfish patterns of thoughts and behavior. So again, low SES people who might feel more vulnerable need to pay more attention to their environment and pay more attention to cultivating relationships with other people. Let's look at one more extension of this theory. Do wealthy people tend to act more unethically? And this is a question that was also asked by a researcher at Berkeley. You might be seeing a theme. This is a person named Paul Piff. And he asked this question by setting up the following experiment. He was trying to see whether you could detect different patterns of behavior among drivers that were correlated with how fancy and expensive their cars were. So are people in Mercedes-Benzes or Ferraris more likely to be jerks in traffic than people who are driving, a Kia Rio or a car that's 20 years old? And in particular, this is what they did. So they had a research assistant in the Bay Area who would go up right to the edge of a crosswalk, and they would make it very clear. So if you can see right here, this person is almost stepping into traffic. They're clearly waiting, and they had the legal right of way because it is a crosswalk, right? So another research assistant is standing across the intersection, and they are marking every car that pulls up. What do? Do they blow through the intersection, or do they slow down, and do they stop? So they ranked these cars from lowest status, that would be the 10-year-old Kia Rio that has a huge dent in the front, to the highest status. This would be your Beamers and your Mercedes-Benzes, so 1 through 5. And the lower status cars actually cut the pedestrian off 0% of the time. So go Kia Rio, right? And the Beamers and the Benzes cut them off almost 45% of the time. So what we're seeing is that lower socioeconomic status is actually connected with a lot of really good stuff. Being aware of other people's emotions, putting more energy into your interpersonal interactions, maybe even being polite or rule following or considerate in these kind of small everyday situations. Does this mean that it's always better to be lower class? Well, probably on a personal level, we understand that this isn't the case, right? And that's part of what your reading is all about for this week. So just to give you a taste of this, we're going to be learning and talking in class about results that show that SES is actually strongly correlated with health and longevity, and not in a way that benefits people with less education or less money, right? Our next and final video for the day is going to be talking about our perceptions of social inequality. So not just class, but actually the spectrum of wealth and income across an entire community. So that's it for now. I'll see you in our next video, and I'll see you in class. Bye, folks.